Regime types and war. Here you can see an Indian Centurion tank. The democratic peace argument. In the early 1990s, Bush and later Clinton repeatedly mentioned that the US wanted democracy to spread around the world because democracies do not go to war against each other. This is from President Clinton's 1999 speech. Quote, "Promoting democracy abroad does more than foster our ideals. It advances our interests because we know that the larger the pool of democracies, the better off we and the entire community of nations will be. Democracies create free markets that make far more reliable trading partners and are far less likely to wage war on one another. While democracy will not soon take hold everywhere, it is in our interest to do all we can to enlarge the community of free and open societies." Close quotes. President Woodrow Wilson said essentially the same thing 80 years earlier, and it seems convincing. Of course, and I want to qualify it, President Woodrow Wilson also reintroduced racial segregation in Washington. So the question can be asked, democracy for whom? Democracies and war. The ongoing debate rages between whether monadic democracies, that means democracies on their own and not in a relationship to another state, are more peaceful or not than non-democracies. The weight of the evidence suggests that democracies are statistically as likely to be involved in interstate war as non-democracies. This does not mean that democracies start as many wars. They may simply be the targets of the wars. The statistical evidence is as follows. Democratic dyads are 14 times less likely to engage in war than non-democratic dyads. Estimates for the level of a state's democracy comes from Ted Robert Gurr's Polity 4 dataset, which ranks the democracy level of each state on a ranking of 1 to 10, and most studies assume a state is minimally democratic in scores of 6 or greater. O'Neill and Russett in 1999 came up with some findings. They found that democracies are monadically more peaceful than non-democracies. This assertion is disputed in the literature. Democratic dyads are the least war-prone of all the dyads. Particular democratic, non-democratic war proneness is a characteristic of the post-Second World War period and not present in the lead-up to it or in the 19th century. Because we have this idea that democracies are liberal, and so they're naturally hostile to illiberal states. People are offended by human rights violations in other areas. But there's no evidence for that being a cause of war before the Second World War or the 19th century. As the democratic proportion of the membership of the international system increases, systemic war proneness decreases even for non-democratic dyads. Now, the statistical evidence is that democracies tend not to initiate wars, but do embark on them more frequently. However, democracies are no more likely to be peaceful than non-democratic states. Democracies do occasionally invade other countries, like the US invading Grenada in the 1980s, or Panama. Alternative explanations have been controlled for, including proximity between countries, levels of power, the status levels, alliance relationships, militarization, economic development, and capability differentials. Regional peace occurs when strong states with established inner peace enter into relations. Before 1914, there was a conflict of interest between the democracies, and that this was reflected by a higher dispute rate than even non-democratic dyads. So this would be, for example, England and France in 1898 confronting each other at Fashoda, Sudan over who is going to colonize that part of East Africa. After 1945, democracies had a common interest in standing up to the Soviet Union, and that therefore there was a confounding variable that diminished the conflicts of interest. So, the sources of thought on democratic regime behavior. We have liberal imperialism. Classical Greeks and northern Italian states, described by authors like Machiavelli, thought that mixed republics, which focused on liberty, were effectively very warlike. So there was no democratic peace phenomenon in the system, either of ancient Greece or in northern Italy, or the democratic representative process in the city of Rome didn't make it more peaceful. There's liberal internationalism. This was formulated by Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, and he conjectured the existence of a Pacific Union. This would be a separate peace between democracies. So this world would contain three definite articles. One, a state has a republican constitution, and this would include moral autonomy, individualism, and social order. Two, republics could create a Pacific Union between each other. And three, cosmopolitan law. Laws apply to locals, and they also apply to foreigners, and this facilitates commerce. Peace follows from international trade by taking it away from state policy. War outside the Union can happen to protect freedom and property or support liberal allies. So what causes the democratic peace? So let's start with a definition. Democracies are states with a liberal ideology that includes free speech, regular competitive elections, almost universal suffrage, and have had at least one democratic change of government. Robert Dahl used a different term for democracy. He called it polyarchy, and these are his elements. 1. Freedom to form and join organizations. 2. Freedom of expression. 3. The right to vote. 4. Eligibility for public office. 5. The right of political leaders to compete for support and votes. 6. Alternative sources of information in the media. 7. Free and fair elections. 8. Institutions for making government policies depend on votes and other expressions of preference. We also have liberal pacifism, and this was formulated by Joseph Schumpeter. He saw capitalism combined with democracy as creating liberal pacifism. So for him, the definition of liberal is 1. Individual freedom, 2. Political participation, 3. Private property, and 4. Equality of opportunity. But this does raise the question of what is democracy? Here we have the percentage of competitive systems in the international system is defined as a democracy. So in 1812, not a lot of countries, just a few percent. And even within those countries that were here ascribed as democratic, half the population, women, didn't vote. This is a more conservative evaluation of when democracy started, and it includes women voters. And you can see that democracy is therefore, from the perspective of this lecture, a century and a half old at most. You can see here the increase in the franchise or the vote in England. Now it should be qualified, because I've looked at this part of the history, that the vote was not exclusively increased in England and shared with the lower classes because the lower classes were demanding it. There was also a significant number of upper class people who wanted the vote to spread because they disagreed ideologically with some of the more conservative policies that were not necessarily associated with votes. And so by having the franchise spread, they created allies. I call this the Flamininus effect. Flamininus was a competitor in the social wars in Rome, and the way that the social war dynamic worked was that as Rome was constantly caught in these civil wars during the social wars, that was the century and a half before Christ, before the Common Era, the Romans that were doing the most poorly and were losing would go outside of Rome, collect allies, take those resources, challenge the conservative forces in Rome, and then extend Roman citizenship to these new communities. And that's essentially how, through violence and the creation of these allies, the Flamininus effect, that you had citizenship spread from Rome to the entire Italian peninsula. So you had the same dynamic going on in England. A lot of the vote was pushed by the political elite itself, the wealthiest who lived at the top. Now the problem is that the Polity 4 dataset gives the US a score of 9 on 10 as a democracy in 1812, at a time when you had legalized slavery. But it only gave Peru a 2 on 10 in 1994. And I think it has to do with the valuations are not objective. They're related to what was thought of as the most democratic state at the time. And so it's a problem in terms of the scoring because these scores are not comparable across time. So there are three explanations for the democratic peace. The first one is the normative cause of the democratic peace, right? The reason why democracies don't fight each other. So here, the key element are liberal ideas. These are cosmopolitan, which means they are applied to all states. You have liberty and toleration for life and property, and tyranny over individuals is not democracy. Liberal democracies are therefore seen as reasonable, predictable, and trustworthy. But democracies are still as warlike as other states, so it depends on perception. Citizens can identify other liberal states and therefore treat them preferentially in a form of a legal zone of law. Citizens only support war typically if it brings peace and are therefore more likely to support war against illiberal states. And in theory, illiberal leaders are therefore selected out. Now this is not always true. How many times was Winston Churchill or Richard Nixon accused of being a warmonger? Right? Whether or not it's actually true. A second explanation for the democratic peace is the structural argument, the argument of institutional constraints. The same domestic institutions that encourage peaceful negotiations and compromise cause democratic states to interact with each other on that same basis. You basically get a lawyer. The more mature the democracy, the greater is the above tendency. Democratic interactions with non-democratic states does not lead to the same restraint. Democracies have participated in imperialism and wars of conquest. Structural domestic practices are extended to the creation of compatible international organizations. So of course the United Nations looks like some sort of early medieval Christian council where you have a panel of people, representatives who debate ideas. So, the statistics. Norms, a byproduct of a successful collective security system that manages to alter expectations and legitimate behavior in the international system, fluctuate in their effect on peace. In the Metternich concert, which is 1816 to 1848, this is Metternich, the great diplomat who set up the concert system after the defeat of Napoleon, was generally peaceful. However, the Bismarckian period, he unified Prussia with Germany in 1870, and he basically reigned from 1849 to 1870, was a less peaceful period. Both periods had the same number of disputes, but 4 of these escalated to war in the Bismarckian period. So, you look at the international system and the impact of democracies at that time, it's not clear what explains the difference between the two periods. Right? Clearly, the presence of the ability to negotiate between states didn't create peace. There wasn't an institutional pacification. The third explanation is organizational. This is a marginal explanation. It's not one of the two main ones, which are normative and structural. So the assumption is that leaders seek policies that will minimize their displacement by other groups, their removal. 2, democratic leaders seek a plurality, which is the largest group of voters, whereas authoritarian leaders appeal to a smaller number of constituents. 3, democratic leaders are more likely to erode the size of their coalition by alienating minority supporters. Therefore, the longer the tenure of an authoritarian leader, the more likely they are to believe they will survive a political gamble, and so they are more likely to risk engaging in war. In addition, Democracies are more transparent and are therefore less able to conduct wars. Declarations made by democratic leaders are more credible because of the consequences of misleading the electorate. The cost to a democratic political leader of changing a public commitment is called an audience cost. Democratic leaders are more vulnerable to audience costs than authoritarian leaders who typically have a more narrow support base. This is a theory developed by Fearon, F-E-A-R-O-N. So what's the evidence? Victory in war reduces by 25% the likelihood of removal from office. 2. Costly wars increase the likelihood of removal. And what's some of the other evidence? 90% of democratic leaders lose their office within a year after losing a war, whereas only 50% of non-democratic leaders lose office, suggesting democratic leaders are more cautious about initiating conflicts. Democratic states are therefore more careful when going to war and are therefore more likely to win the wars they fight because, of course, they're choosing the wars they can win. And so democracies are victorious 81% of the time. For example, neither U.S. Presidents Truman or Johnson sought re-election while involved in their unwinnable wars. The wars in Korea for Truman and Vietnam for Johnson. So the overall statistical evaluation has been that the normative model is more robust than the structural, meaning domestic populations judge other society as being liberal or not, whether or not they're democratic. And it's a more convincing argument than the structural argument, which is it's the institutions that interact. Now there are exceptions that abound. 1790 to 1798, the French-American War, they were both democracies. 1803, 1812, US-UK, both democracies. 1861, 1863, US-UK dispute, both democracies. Ecuador-Colombia, 1863, both democracies. 1870, France and Prussia, debatable. Prussia had a legislature, and the legislature was powerful. But the bureaucracy and the military leadership of the state also had significant extra constitutional powers. 1895, 1896 dispute between the US and UK over Venezuela, both democracies. 1898 Spanish-American War, big dispute. How exactly do we characterize Spain? Was it democratic? It had a constitution similar to that of the US. 1899, United States, Philippines and the Second Philippine War. 1899 to 1902, the Anglo-Boer War. The Dutch definitely were self-ruled. 1919, the Lithuanian-Polish War. 1940, the British attack on the French fleet. Now, arguably, the Vichy government at the time wasn't elected. They were appointed as a part of the French capitulation after the Nazi defeat of France. 1940, the French-Thailand War. The 1941-44 War of Finland in the Second World War against Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, the US, and the UK. But of course, we never fought Finland directly. The Finnish fought the Soviet Union. The 1948 Israeli-Lebanon conflict is a part of Israel's War of Independence. The 1965 India-Pakistan conflict. The 1967 Israel-Lebanon conflict. The 1971 Indo-Pakistan War, although again heavily debated because Pakistan had a constrained government, and that government had suppressed the previous election. The 1974 Cyprus-Turco-Cypriot conflict. The 1981-82 Israel-Lebanon conflict. The 1999 NATO-Serbian conflict. The 2006 Israel-Lebanon conflict. The 2008 Russia-Georgia conflict. So many exceptions. Are these really democracies? So these exceptions should suggest that it is not that democracies don't go to war, but that they reduce the likelihood of war. What is the utility of a theory that cannot fail, that states that change their regime types in the period before a conflict erupts into war, which raises the question of the utility of democracy in preventing war in the first place? So a lot of those cases had countries that were democracies and they changed their regimes just prior to the war. So was the war chosen by the democracy, or was it a result of the change in government? So there are some problems with the democratic peace theory. There are 6 objections. The first one is, well, there's no theoretical foundation. All of this could be a spurious effect. And this comes from the Gibler article in your text, 2007. Gibler argues, democracies are less likely to fight each other because they have settled already their border disputes. And it is this peace that's already been settled that has created democracy. This comes from an argument by Otto Hinz in 1906. He argued that geography confers security, and security allows democracy to exist. And so it's no surprise that it's almost always the most easily defended countries that are the most democratic. Authoritarian political systems are more likely during periods of danger of war because of the presence of a larger military in the government. And this more easily facilitates repression of most of the domestic political constituency. This is why democracies tend to be found where there are small armies. The British had a large navy, but they always had a small army. The second objection is that it's a tautological definition. Definitions of democracy in war change to protect the hypothesis, to protect the proposition. For example, property and gender requirements excluded many from voting right up until the 20th century. So these were not really democracies, were they? But they're defined as democracies. Number 3, democratic peace theory is not statistically significant. There are so very few democratic states over the centuries, and so very few opportunities, therefore, for democracies to fight each other. Number 4, the problem of subjectivity. So, if you have a desire for peace or war, this could be determined by whether or not you think someone else is democratic or despotic. So, mutual perceptions are crucial. In the War of 1812, the British characterized the Americans as non-democratic, and the Americans characterized the British as non-democratic. The British had a monarchy, the Americans had slavery. During the Spanish-American War of 1899, the Americans characterized Spain as backward, and therefore, maybe constitutionally democratic, but otherwise socially not democratic. What do you think of these cases? Spain was actually democratic by today's institutional definition. There's the problem of illiberal democracies. In Iran, there is voting that's generally fair and without corruption. There's also freedom of assembly. But there's the absence of freedom for the individual. There are heavy constraints on what individuals can do and say in public. Doesn't that have a constraining effect on democracy? How is Iran viewed by Western democracies? Number 6, democracies are very fragile, and so states under wartime threat are rarely democracies. This is the theory of the garrison state, where states in preparation for war adopt policies that harden themselves. A democracy undermines itself if it, 1, does not deliver material wealth, and 2, it destroys a traditional way of life, which is why a lot of democratic transitions are actually violent. If you're a traditional elite, or even if you're a traditional farmer, you may resist democratic progress. During the French Revolution, the French peasants in the Vendée revolted in order to protect their traditional rights and to protect their landowners. And democracies fail all the time. They fail when they don't produce what they promise, which is economic wealth. Eastern Europe abandoned the Warsaw Pact in 1989, Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania. But it wasn't automatic. It mostly happened because the working class, and there was a large working class in the factories, decided to allow it to happen. But it could have gone the other way. Those workers gambled on a better prospect to get consumer goods, but they risked having their factories closed and losing their jobs. So it was a much more complex matter. It was not inevitable. So here's a list of exceptions captured by hypotheses. Hypothesis 1. Liberal states trust liberal states and distrust illiberal states. The obvious exception to this is apartheid South Africa, which eventually collapsed in 1993. The US and UK were very close allies of South Africa and built for South Africa the largest naval base south of the equator in the world. South Africa provided titanium, which is the main material to build combat aircraft, platinum. It was the largest source of those materials outside of the Soviet Union. It had uranium. It was a key protector of the oil supply coming from the Persian Gulf in the supertankers. South Africa received aircraft from Western states. Despite having a racialized and a segregated political system that excluded the majority of the local population from voting, it was seen as a key Western ally until the 1980s, when policies were adopted by most Western states against it. Second hypothesis, liberals expect peace with other liberal states. When democratic India, led by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, invaded East Pakistan to turn it into Bangladesh, they were confronted by a U.S. aircraft carrier, the Enterprise, which had been sent from the coast of Vietnam by American President Richard Nixon, who wanted to signal U.S. support for Pakistan. This caused India to abbreviate their amphibious landing at Cox's Bazar in East Pakistan and to remove their fleet from the Bay of Bengal. So India feared what the U.S. Navy, which was equipped with nuclear weapons on the aircraft carrier, would do. This is not what we would expect between two liberal democratic states. Hypothesis 3. Liberal states share the ends with other liberal states, but not with illiberal states. So North Korea was a despotic communist government in the 1970s and 80s. In the 1970s and 80s, South Korea had a military government that was also occasionally despotic, although perhaps not as badly as North Korea. But it was depicted as a westernized, progressive state and a close Western ally. Hypothesis 4. Liberal states will not change assessments of other states unless they change their institution. The Soviet Union in the Second World War was a communist totalitarian power, but was depicted by Western propaganda as a stalwart ally and a key ally against the fight against Nazism. Hypothesis 5. Liberal elites will agitate for their policies during war-threatening crises with other liberal states. We would have expected when the CIA went into Guatemala to overturn the socialist-leaning government there, that the elites there would have appealed to the American people. But the American people it didn't resonate with them to save a Central American state. So the CIA was ultimately able to overthrow the government in Guatemala in 1954. Not what you'd expect between two democracies. Hypothesis 6. During crises, liberal states follow liberal policies. Well, it's not always true. Russia was a democracy, but its policy in Chechnya against independence forces there was fairly brutal. Not what you'd expect from a democracy. So what are some of the alternative explanations for this phenomenon that democracies don't fight each other? They probably do indeed mostly not fight each other. But is it the structural, the normative, or the organizational argument that explains why, or another factor? So, explanation 1. Transnational organization makes peace. All of the hegemons in the post-Napoleonic period were democracies, and so they imposed that type of institution on the international system. First it was the UK, commerce-minded, and peace makes for good business, and then the US. The second explanation is distance prevents war. The democracies were just too far, historically, from each other to actually fight each other. The British and American navies met each other frequently on the high seas, but to actually have a war with each other, they'd have to travel to some flat land somewhere conveniently close where they could battle, but they didn't. They were too far. Hypothesis 3. Alliances make peace. Most of the democracies were in the same alliance, repeatedly. There are a couple of exceptions, but those were very far away. Allies are not going to fight each other. 4. Wealth makes peace. Most of the countries that became democratic started with a strong middle class and a good commercial base, And so those that are in power don't want to imperil their wealth. So of course they're not going to encourage a war. Certainly not encourage a war with their trading partner. Number 5, political stability makes peace. Now, if you have political stability, then the people are happy, and then there's no need to go fight. There's no diversionary incentive to start a war somewhere else. Number 6, common culture causes both peace and democracy. This is an argument from Henderson about democracy and war. There's also the realist counter-argument, which is, well, where has democracy started? This is, again, Otto Hins's argument. Well, it started in the most defensible states. First the UK, then the US, and of course it spreads across the English Channel to France. So we can see democracy, though, is not inevitable, but when it expands and spreads, there is a certain element of geographic contiguity. We've had 3 waves of democracy. The first full democracy was the US, albeit with indirect elections when it was adopted and first founded. Since the mid-19th century, democracy has gradually been adopted by an increasing number of states. According to Samuel Huntington, democracy spread in 3 waves. From 1820 to 1920, there were 29 democracies. Between 1922 and 1940, that number fell to 12 because of the Great Depression, because of fighting in Eastern Europe. The second wave was between 1940 and 1962. It rose to 24. But then it fell again in the 1970s because of heavy debt, because of the recession, because of the oil crisis. When democracies don't deliver promised economic growth and employment, they're quickly replaced. The third wave added many new democratic states after the end of the Cold War. The demonstration effect of the collapse of the Soviet Union compelled many populations to demand that their leaders become democratic. But then the democracies in some places fell down in the 90s and the early 2000s in countries like Thailand and Pakistan. Here you can see the political systems in 1914. You did have a lot of republics. You have constitutional monarchies, but that actually is not a very accurate description of the type of government. You had a fair number of autocratic monarchies and a lot of colonial territory. So in general, with each democratic wave, democracy has spread farther and become more durable. Now there is an exception, and these are transitional democracies. When you have a new democracy, the change of regime type has often changed the basis of the legitimacy for that regime. So new governments often fall back on nationalist principles to get support from the population. So it's not surprising that the most war-prone states are democracies that are newly fashioned. And the classic example is Serbia. Serbia was created out of the collapsed state of Yugoslavia. The regime transitioned out of communism, but the political parties that did the best were ones that were nationalist because they sought to resolve issues of the mixed ethnicities in the regions around Serbia. So Serbia aggressively participated in fighting in Bosnia by providing support and ultimately was the target of NATO bombing over Kosovo. And so you'll find young democracies as not necessarily peaceful. Now the second regime type are military regimes. So, how states led by military governments cause war. So let's have a definition first. A military government is typified by a leader with significant experience at the planning level of the military and whose government is organized along military lines. So we have, starting at the left, Pinochet, a Chilean military leader who took power in a coup against Allende. Then we have Saddam Hussein. He occasionally wears a uniform. He's not a military person. He used the Republican Guard as a shield to protect the regime, the Ba'athist Party, or his version of it, against the military. We have Fidel Castro, who's created a political party that he uses to overwatch the military. And plus he has a lot of personal prestige himself. He fought as an insurgent, but not in a general war, although he did lead his country to wars in Angola and Ethiopia. Then we have Muammar Gaddafi, a colonel in the Libyan army, definitely someone with military background. And in the top right, we have Yitzhak Rabin, who had extensive military experience. And although Israel is a democracy, the individuals that serve in the government have a disproportionate amount of senior military experience. So what are the statistics? Well, of the military government, the more centralized the government, including in democracies, the more likely the state is to be involved in an interstate conflict. Military executives typically consist of 4 persons or less. These are often called juntas, as opposed to a cabinet of 15 to 20, which is more typical of civilian governments. Alternative interpretations of the findings are, well, it may simply be that states that are about to undergo war because they're anticipating war quickly centralize their government because having 15 to 20 members on a cabinet is not that efficient. You could, for example, compare Winston Churchill's wartime cabinet, which included Attlee, the leader of the Labour Party, and how many ministers were involved in that, compared with the number of ministers involved in the British government prior to World War II. The conventional wisdom is that military leaders are more aggressive. They like war, and it is their belief in the use of force that causes military states to go to war. But this has actually very little evidence. In a study of Cold War crisis decision-making by U.S. civilian and military leaders, Richard Betts, a professor at Columbia University, found that on average, military leaders were no more likely to advocate the use of force than their civilian counterparts. The difference is when they want to use force, and we're going to look at that in a later slide. So the militaries typically take over in a state through a coup against a civilian government or against other military governments. And they almost always do it for one of 2 reasons. One, the civilian government was widely viewed as corrupt or incompetent or divisive or threatening to the military's status. Or 2, there was an external threat to the state that the civilian government was ignoring or dealing with poorly. So, the military mentality. This is one of the explanations for how the military think, and it's not necessarily war-prone. There are 2 key aspects of the military mentality. One, the most important principle of combat, that is the core of military profession, is the principle of the concentration of force. At the point of attack, you always want to maximize the concentration of your forces against the weakness of the enemy. The greater the difference in strength, the greater exponentially is the difference between the losses of the stronger and the weaker side. The actual math is the inverse hyperbolic tan, and it's captured by the Lanchester equations. And if you take my other courses, you will actually do the math. And the math is stark. Military planners are therefore preoccupied with obtaining this concentration of force to get friendly forces to concentrate against the enemy's weak point, where the attacker's force ratio is maximized against the defender. Since all militaries want the same goal, you have to be able to do it faster and sooner than the adversary. Hence, the military emphasis is on initiative. The ability to move first matters because it permits one side to place its forces more favorably to achieve the desired concentration of force. This is one major reason why military leaders are often so eager to escalate disputes to war. Not because they enjoy the violence, but because to lose the initiative could be fatal. The first move gives a tremendous advantage, specifically, again, the inverse hyperbolic tan in losses. For Richard Betts, quote, generals prefer using force quickly, massively, and decisively to destroy enemy capabilities, rather than rationing it gradually to coax the enemy to change their intentions, close quote. Military leaders therefore prefer to escalate a dispute very rapidly, and in fact, to jump straight to attack rather than permitting diplomatic negotiations that enable the enemy to prepare, and thereby cause an increase in friendly losses when the war does eventually come. More negotiations is often equated to more friendly dead. This tendency has been verified through survey research in the militaries of states as varied as the US and Sweden, the latter of which has not been involved in the war for at least 2 centuries. For the period from 1929 to 1979, there's a tendency to escalate crises was more likely among military regimes. So specifically, democracies escalated crises 37% of the time, a civil authoritarian 49%, and militaries 63%. As were tendencies to escalate crises to war. Democracies 21% of the time, civil authoritarian states 18% of the time, and militaries 39% of the time. So it is true that the militaries are very escalatory. Number 2, military leaders argue that the danger of war requires increased armaments. They seldom argue that increased armaments make war practical or desirable. Military people want security. They want to survive. Military leaders prefer not going to war over going to war and losing it, because defeat reduces the security of the state. Consequently, militaries tend to oppose adventurous foreign policies. The German army was not enthusiastic in supporting Adolf Hitler's gamble to become the hegemon of Europe. Richard Betts has found that in Cold War crises involving U.S. decision makers, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, whose forces was most likely to bear the brunt of the fighting, was the most reluctant to recommend the use of force, and in fact more reluctant to recommend the use of force than their civilian counterparts. If you recall, General Colin Powell, the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, recommended against going to war against Saddam Hussein in the lead up to the 1991 Persian Gulf War. So here's the head of the military publicly saying we should not go to war. The second insight on how military people think is military organization. Military decision making has 3 discrete organizational biases. 1, militaries are highly specialized and rigidly hierarchical organizations designed to survive and execute missions in an extremely lethal, uncertain, and potentially fast-paced combat environment. The information system is bidirectional but highly specialized. Tactical intelligence gets pushed upwards, the location and the strength of enemy forces. Orders are then pushed down the chain of command for execution. Although streamlined for fast transmission, the specific set of organizational routines cannot accommodate other types of information very efficiently. Two, the military's preoccupation with the state's security leads it to stress the existence of foreign threats all the time, and the likelihood of being attacked. To appraise these, the military relies upon an assessment of combat capabilities because political analysis is beyond its core competence, and because a focus on an opponent's arsenal is both feasible and in line with the military's reliance on worst-case analysis. 3. The military is attuned to changes in the military balance and is likely therefore to exaggerate the benefit of a perceived window of opportunity. States decide to start wars when they believe they are about to be attacked, or when the cost of attacking is less than the cost of the status quo. For militarized states, the thresholds for attack under these circumstances are lower, mainly because their sensitivity to shifts in the military balance increases the shadow of the future, and an urgency to respond to expected changes. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted to attack Cuba before Cuba consolidated their revolution. Number 3, military government and cybernetic decision making. You must recall our earlier discussion about cybernetic effects. A civilian-run constitutional government has a very unmilitary organization. It has many branches: legal, police, international affairs, economic, public works, intelligence, military, domestic, media. And these are integrated and managed through a single administrative body. It could be a cabinet, it could be the bureaucracy. Authority is decentralized to maximize the specialization of the different components of the government in handling the incoming information. Military leaders, when operating within this kind of constitutionally defined civilian government, are more likely to be conservative in their advocacy for war, because they are made more fully aware of the political limits within which they must operate. They're told you can use military force, but these are the limits. These are the rules of engagement. These are the targets you cannot shoot at. The constraints the military operate within are best described by Karl von Clausewitz, who wrote the book called On War, or Der Krieg. He came up with a quote, "War is policy by other means," close quote. Wars don't happen for their own sake, but because they serve some political goal of the state. All war is trying to achieve a political goal. Military leaders in the civilian government operate within these political limits. They're made aware of it by their participation in the policy process. For Clausewitz, he was trying to resolve the philosophic problem of unlimited war. And he found that most wars were not unlimited. So for him, he called this the absolute war versus the real war. Absolute wars are two sides fight forever until one side is wiped out. But this never happened. And he found that it's because in real war, you have political limitations. And the political limitations include severe limitations on resources. Countries are not that wealthy. War is very expensive. Citizens don't want to lose their lives. And so those constraints transform absolute unlimited war to very limited real war. During the Korean War, U.S. Commander Douglas MacArthur, you can see depicted on the top right, wanted to attack Chinese bases and bridges. Now, while this might have made the communist Chinese forces weaker and helped the survival of the UN that was then fighting in Korea, it probably would have provoked a wider war with China, and it was going to undermine the U.S. government's strategy of peeling communist China away from communist Soviet Union. Now, because of his public persistence and his constant harassment of the U.S. president, President Truman fired him. And this is, of course, appropriate because generals engage in war in order to implement policy defined by elected officials. But you'll constantly see quotes in popular books and media and biographies, autobiographies written by generals, that war is too complicated to be left to civilian leaders. And that is completely false in the sense that once the military leaders think that, they're going to lose control of those elements in society that support the war. And probably the best examination of the catastrophic collapse of that kind of system is Germany at the end of the First World War. Hindenburg and Ludendorff were the commanders put in charge of the war after the Kaiser, the King of Germany, was essentially delegitimized as a competent leader. And in the conduct of their war, they alienated the entire legislature. They alienated the entire population. And they alienated the German Navy, which went on strike as socialists. So the consequences of military government are as follows. One, there's a tendency to rapid escalation of crises and disputes. Military governments avoid diplomatic situations or diplomatic solutions. Two, there's a tendency to embark into war without a careful evaluation of alliance politics. Statistically, it's been found that non-democracies are more likely than democracies to fight severe wars, wars with high casualties. In the case of military regimes, the severity of war results from an inability to isolate target states from their allies or to obtain allies for themselves. Every single time Pakistan's fought India, it's done it alone, and India had allies. Military governments are incompetent at playing the alliance game. When they embark in a war, they fail to realize the balance of power dynamic. And so they end up in wars that they didn't anticipate, wars that are long, wars that are costly. Many people die. Democracies are much better at playing the alliance game, so they pick their wars with much greater skill. Number three, military governments are more interested in geostrategic disputes that affect the immediate security of the state than in disputes that originate in domestic politics or are of a symbolic nature. Paradoxically, military regimes are less likely to go to war over a symbolic dispute. So it sounds very peculiar, but when Pakistan's military influence was the strongest in Pakistan, which is 1954, when the military essentially ruled Pakistan with the bureaucracy, 1958, after the military coup, relations with India over Kashmir were the most peaceful. The Pakistanis referred the Kashmir problem to the UN. The military did not want to fight a war over Kashmir. It had already gotten as much as it thought it could ever get, and the military's interest in Kashmir was not Islamic irredentism. It was the fact that all the rivers in Pakistan come through Kashmir, so it was a strategic choice. The Pakistan military didn't want to fight the 1965 war over Kashmir. The war started by isolated commanders in the north. The Israeli army in 1967 wanted to focus on fighting the Syrians in the Golan because the army was preoccupied with trying to protect the settlements from Syrian artillery. The Israeli army wanted to conquer the Sinai because it created a buffer against Egypt, a much larger country. The Israeli military did not want to conquer the West Bank and Jerusalem, amazingly. So, for the Israeli military to not want to attack the most important city in Israel, Jerusalem, is fairly remarkable and is a strong indicator of what happens when the military mentality affects military choice on policy.